afternoon. Welcome to this Class Acts presentation on the theme of city development and urban history. Here is the starting point for this afternoon's presentation. Our world of the early 21st century is to a large degree defined by large-sized cities. But what do we really know of the urban settlements that we live in? Or the cities that we visit when we go on vacation? Or the places where globalized business occurs? In this short talk, an introduction to urban history is given. As such, a basic question is put forward. How can studying the urban past help us to better understand our cities today? Hello, how are you? Thank you so much for giving me some of your time this afternoon. Let me take a moment to briefly introduce myself. I am Ian Morley, and I work here in the Chinese University of Hong Kong at the Department of History. I'm somebody interested in cities, and I'm especially interested in their history from the perspective of environmental design. My research focuses upon American influence in the Philippines with respect to the evolution of colonial city planning, and you can see on the screen a couple of examples of my published work. You might rightly ask, why should a historian be interested in cities, and in particular, be interested in their appearance and plan? Well, to get straight to the point, to study historic built environments opens a window to discover, to explore, and to explain the cultural, social, political, and economic meanings encoded in human habitats that were formed and developed in the past. The character of historic built fabrics, you see, not only reflects the influence of political agencies, but it also displays people's social and economic concerns, which in turn shape their behavior and social action. As such, embedded in city design is a living history of political, economic, social, and cultural meanings and intentions. But to understand this is not straightforward. It is said that cities are the most complex of all human inventions. You and I live in a city that is well known throughout the world. We live in a place that brands itself as Asia's world city. But what do we really know of Hong Kong and its urban environmental history? More to the point, and now getting you to think much more generally, what do we know of cities in the world today and how they impact themselves upon us in terms of the way that we live? Our world today consists of local cultures that sit alongside a global culture and economy that is basically grounded in large-sized cities. More than 4 billion people live in urban places, and statistics from the United Nations reveal that the 10 biggest cities have a combined population of more than 230 million people. But, to repeat my earlier question, what do we really understand about cities at this point in time in the early 21st century? And so, by association, what do we know of their history? After all, it's easy for us today in our highly modern, technologically driven and globalized world to think that our cities have little or nothing in common with the urban world of the past. Yet if we think like this, then we are being so factually wrong. Cities during the past few thousand years have played a vital role in developing civilization. It is impossible to think of the evolution of particular civilizations in the past without thinking of their cities. Cities, in every historical era and in every geographical context, have been not just the engines of economic expansion, but they have also been the centers of cultural growth, social progress, and political change. Towns and cities of the past, and today, contain 4 basic common elements. Number 1, they are the sites of decision-making. It is within them that we find the public and private institutions and organizations that shape political and economic power. Number 2, irrespective of their physical size, their density, and population size, cities provide people with opportunities to escape the rigidities of traditional rural society and to participate in a variety of lifestyles and behaviors. Number 3, urban places are where things get done. Cities provide environments for organizing labor, capital, and materials, and they are the places where physical infrastructure is found so that the services necessary to the efficient running of society can occur. And then number 4, the concentration of people within cities makes for human interaction and competition, which in turn promotes innovation and the exchange of knowledge and information. It is no coincidence, therefore, that when you spend time to consider your future as a student or as a worker, you basically will see it as an urban-centered one. You already know, as an outcome of your life experiences, that it is within cities where universities, museums, sports stadia, palaces, transport links, and an array of cultural facilities are located. You know as well, thanks to your accumulated knowledge, that if you want to go into business, you will be dealing directly with other people in an urban setting. It will be highly likely that your workforce will be born and raised within a town and city, and that your customers will be urban-based if you're looking at potential markets to exploit. So cities, as I'm trying to indicate, should not be understood solely as the locales of concentrations of sometimes large numbers of people. They also need to be understood as being the sites where human endeavour occurs, and in the past has occurred. However, we cannot ignore the vast numbers of people today living in cities. Why, you might ask? Well, let's step it back in time a little in order to answer this question. In 1800, in other words, about 200 or so years ago, when the world's first industrial revolution was gathering pace in England, less than 5% of the world's population lived in urban settlements. In other words, human life in different places and under different cultures was firmly fixed to rural locations. But in the 19th and 20th century, a major change occurred. People living in all the world's continents moved from the countryside into towns and cities. Consequently, by the early years of this century, for the first time in human history, we live in a world that is predominantly urban. The majority of people now live in towns and cities, not the countryside. So for me, as a historian, I am interested to know, how did we get to this point of human evolution? In other words, how in the past did people establish the building blocks that helped to create the modern world that we live in today? As an urban historian, knowing the influence of cities upon this process is central to my being. You see, the common mistake that people make about studying history is that to know the past has no relevance or value. I mean, you might hear from someone, what consequence or importance does learning about the ancient Greeks or Romans have to understanding our world today? Well, people who say things like this are greatly missing the point. They don't understand what history as a subject is. Yes, history is about investigating and comprehending the past, but the fundamental reason why historians do this is in order to know how the present has come into being. To keep things simple, history is a means to generate a time link. The knowledge developed from its study allows you and I to link past to present, and then by knowing what the present is, to see the potential direction of society in the future. So what does this mean then, when considering the theme of cities and their development? How can learning the urban past let us better understand the urban present, and possibly the urban future too? Let me briefly highlight 3 things for you to consider in this regard. Point 1. In Western civilization, when we think about the foundation and growth of cities, then in many ways it is impossible to ignore the ancient Greeks. Their legacy is not only evident in the establishment of cities across Europe, or their creation of types of architecture, but also from their innovation in terms of what civil society should be. The Greeks introduced to us the concept and practice of urban well-being. Happiness should be a right for all. And at the same time, the Greeks introduced to the world the idea and practice of urban-centered democracy. Likewise, the ancient Romans took forward the Greeks' notion of administration and governance, which they evolved in the frame of their empire with its countless urban centers, its road and water infrastructures, and through the growth of local, regional, and continental trading routes. This is why, if you travel to Europe, it is possible to find heritage in the form of Roman roads, as well as Roman city walls, aqueducts, colosseums, baths, temples, and public buildings. Central to the existence of Roman civilization was urban design. The layout and the appearance of urban places, large or small, were part of an environmental and political system administered from Rome that sought to show off imperial power. Yet the role of power and influence of power upon cities has not been unique to the Roman way of life. The expressing of power has been a major factor shaping how our cities have been formed and then developed, because at different times and in different regions of the world, the likes of Beijing, Istanbul, Kyoto, London, Moscow, Mexico City, Paris, and Vienna became an expression in brick and stone of imperial power and grandeur. My central point number 2. The rise of industrial economies redesigned cities and created a new kind of urban place, the industrial city, Manchester being the first of this new breed of city. It being an urban place whose basic existence was not to fulfill a military or religious function, but in contrast to acquire raw materials and assemble, manufacture, and distribute goods. Industrial economies were unlike earlier types of economies. They had to be organized with large volumes of labor. They required transport networks, and their development led to a range of new building types, for example, warehouses and factories. Significantly too, industrial cities brought new social, cultural, and environmental dynamics to the fore. New social structures, new levels of poverty, inequality, pollution, and segregation existed within them. So whilst, thanks to the rise of manufacturing industry, a nation could gather great wealth and take on influence outside of its political borders, in contrast, the fast, unplanned growth of cities led to new instances of disease, and in relation, premature death. 4 Ds, deprivation, dirt, disease, and death, became fundamental traits of the industrial city's being. London, for example, the richest and largest city of the 19th century, had an average life expectancy in its slums of less than 20 years. To be poor in London meant the daily risk of dying young. In parts of the city, in the mid-1800s for instance, the poor lived 29 years less than the rich. Therefore, such consequences, together with new ideas for social reform, led to the rise of city planning as a facet of state intervention in order to establish betterment within society. As a phenomenon, city planning was not new. Originally, it had been developed by the ancient Greeks, but under the forces of industrial revolutions, new ideas to design cities were required. In this regard, Paris became a model for cities across the world to follow. Paris's redevelopment in the mid to late 1800s allowed it to redefine itself, not just in economic, political, and technological terms. Paris's environmental renewal from medieval to modern city allowed it to take on a status as a place that was a work of art, and this reputation still endures today. Indeed, when we think of a beautiful city, Paris is still the epitome to most of us. Its buildings, its streets, represent a pride and spirit of human aspiration and achievement. And as an exemplar of urban design, the grandeur and the splendor of the French capital city was especially impacting at the end of the 19th century in the United States. The redevelopment of the American capital city, Washington, D.C., at the beginning of the last century was inspired by changes within Paris. And because of American imperialism in Southeast Asia after the Spanish-American War of 1898, new ideas to lay out cities were introduced in the Philippines, for example in Manila. Now, my third and final key point I wish to talk over with you today is the rise, role, and importance of globalization to city development and the character of the contemporary urban place. The term globalization for most of us refers to the evolution in the late 20th century economic system that, in terms of cities, resulted in an international urban system. The cities of this international system, global cities as we commonly refer to them, are broadly acknowledged to possess key roles in relation to banking and finance, corporate organization, and the work of international agencies. Global cities, to a large degree, are the hubs of flows of information, the places of present-day innovation, and the sites of financial transaction that sustain continental economies and cultural expansion. Accordingly, they provide the interface between the local and the international. They operate as the place for economic, cultural, and institutional apparatus to channel the resources of the global economy back into a nation's provincial centres. But, in reality, globalization is not a 20th century phenomenon. It has a much longer existence. From the late 1500s, that is to say about 400 years before the term globalization was coined and widely taken up, the city of Manila in the Philippines stood at the heart of a trading system that linked the Americas, Africa, Europe, and different regions of Asia together. The commodity fueling the creation and maintenance of this international trading system was silver. It was imported into the Philippines from Mexico and then was purchased by the Ming Dynasty Chinese to sustain their dynasty's need for silver coins. Hence, and here's my broader point, with awareness of urban history phenomenon, we can begin to understand that our world today may be acknowledged through different, and really in fact through more accurate lenses. So to conclude, our cities today are far from perfect, yet we very much take these places of human habitat, our places of habitat, for granted. Therefore, by grasping more insight of the urban past, by means of recognizing how urban systems developed, how urban culture emerged and grew, how places assumed different characters given the local, national, and sometimes global forces operating within them, it permits us to acquire a wisdom that is relevant not just for advanced educations in the setting of schools or universities, but a knowledge that is relevant to us as citizens of society. After all, history shows us that humans have shaped cities, but we also need to acknowledge that cities have shaped us. At the same time, thinking about the history of the urban grants new occasion to ascertain how people in towns and cities have interacted, for instance, with the natural world, and how this engagement has at times produced challenges to our customs, norms, and values. Appraising the association between cities and the world at large is, of course, especially timely given our present-day reality of a disease affecting the well-being of billions of people in countless countries. Without stating the obvious, it has been in cities where the impact of COVID-19 has been most profoundly felt. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. Let's now move to the Q&A session, and let's see what the first question is. So question number 1 that's been sent to me, it says, if I wish to study urban history, what kind of approaches to the urban past can I learn? Well, within urban history as an academic field, there are a number of traditional methodologies that a historian will focus upon. So if you are getting interested in studying the urban past, then really the 3 main traditions that I'd like to just highlight to you now, firstly is to understand about the process of urban development, the speed and the changes of urbanization that occur. Secondly, a main focus within the field of urban history is to examine culture, changes within culture, and as I indicated in my presentation, the overlap, the relationship that civilizations have with cities, and in turn how cities then affect the urban culture in itself. But one of the very common forms of studying urban history is to focus upon a theme. So you may focus on something like housing, policing, crime, public health. These are very, very common elements, approaches that people adopt when they want to study the urban past. But you don't necessarily have to be a historian in order to study the urban past. You can come into contact with the urban past if you're somebody, for instance, who studies, say, fashion. You maybe look at old photographs of people walking in urban scenes, in streets. That gives you an indication of what urban culture and clothing would be like. And likewise, you can be kind of introduced into urban history through reading literature. So just as 2 examples, you may be familiar with Emile Zola, people like Charles Dickens as well. they give you, albeit a fictional, but they nonetheless give you an impression of what urban life was like in the 1800s, in the case of Zola in Paris, and in Dickens's case in London in particular. So thank you very much for that question. Let's move on to the next question. The next question is a very broad question. What makes a good city? Well, it's a very, very hard question to answer because different people at different times, or even today in different cultures, have a different understanding of what makes a good city. Now, there are, there are indexes that different organizations have created to measure what makes a good city. And generally speaking, there are 4 components that I will just highlight to you now, as I've said, that are broadly understood as being influential in making what is, and I use good in an inverted commas, a good city. So the first aspect, or the first component, is ecology. And that is that cities, good cities, have a deep and integrated relationship with the natural environment. This kind of connects with our understanding of what we call sustainability, sustainable development. Second issue that's very, very important is economics, the economic component. That cities should be based on an economy that is organized around the social needs of all people. The important thing there is all citizens. Third aspect of a good city is its politics. Okay? Good cities have an enhanced emphasis on engaged civic involvement. That people, regardless of their gender, their age, their social class, even their race, have an active role in the development of civic society and therefore its evolution. That's considered very, very important. And then the final point is cultural, related to culture. That cities should actively develop processes for dealing with sometimes the uncomfortable intersection between identity and difference. So just to broadly again cover what makes a good city, 4 aspects: the issue of environment, the issue of the economy, thirdly politics, and then fourthly culture. So thank you for that question. Let's move on to the third question. So the question that's now appearing to me, it says, how will COVID-19 affect cities and their development? Well, this is a really, really interesting question, but again, I'm not kind of dodging a bullet here. It's really, really hard to answer because we don't know how long the COVID-19 problem will continue for. So depending on how long we have to socially distance or isolate ourselves from travel, that's obviously going to have an impact. But what I just want to do is I want to just open the question up more widely and think about public health history in general as an aspect of urban history and urban development. Because certainly in the past, we know through urban studies how important disease has been to change. For someone like myself, I'm English, and in England, incidences of disease, particularly a new disease in the 19th century, disease from Asia, cholera, was very, very influential on provoking the political elites to change their attitude and, in a sense, create a new system of urban management. Cholera didn't kill. In comparison to other diseases, it wasn't the biggest killer, but it was a very, very kind of predatory illness that would affect people. You could be healthy today and be dead by tomorrow. So it created a lot of fear. And that fear ultimately led to the British creating new national public health laws. So in a sense, from the 1840s, late 1840s in Britain, wherever you find local democracy, you would find a local board of health. And of course, this model then became very important for places like Hong Kong when the British decided to undertake their imperial expansion. So, will COVID-19 affect cities and their development? Well, again, very hard to say because I think the first task in many cities when COVID-19 is under complete control is to get the economy working again. Maybe somewhere like Hong Kong, it's going to have less impact because we can't just knock down buildings and redevelop at low density. Maybe that will occur in other places, but certainly it might influence our understanding of urban space and density, and certainly how, in the globalized sense, how economies are tied together. We can see that when we have an impact in one area like China, it now has a massive impact on other parts of the world as well. So again, hard question to answer, but thank you very much for offering that question. Next question is, why are different city designs produced at different times in the past? Well, the answer to that really is that there are different influences within different civilizations. Civilizations are different and they evolve through time. So as culture, as politics, as economics, as law, as technology evolves, these will all have imprints on the layout of cities. The big thing about cities, as I mentioned in my talk, is that they, through time, always have common characteristics. The one thing that is different is civilizations and their relationship to how they use technology. And how they use technology can impact greatly on the development of different cities, different city forms. So that maybe is the answer. It's simply because civilizations are different, or at different times, a civilization can be different from what it previously was. So thank you again for that question. Maybe the final question. I talked about Paris. It says, you mentioned about Paris in your presentation. Why is the city seen today as still being so beautiful? Well, let's again think about Paris. Paris is a city that is considered an epitome of beauty, a highly romantic city. Why has that reputation come about? Well, maybe two factors, just to briefly introduce to you. The first factor is we need to remember that Paris, up to the middle of the 19th century, was really a dirty, old, medieval city with a lot of problems. But in the 1850s and 1860s, it was rebuilt. There was an incredible, large-scale transition that took place environmentally within the city, and that produced the urban environment that we are so familiar with today. The Paris that we know today is this post-mid-19th century city that was redesigned according to certain architectural ideas about what urban beauty was. So in a sense, Paris was rebuilt in order to be beautiful. But my second point is we need to recognize that a lot of our imagery of Paris comes from not just our familiarity with, say, images of the Eiffel Tower, but really images from art. That when the city was rebuilt, it became an environment for impressionist artists. So Paris, by the end of the 19th century and since then, is seen as a very, very artistic city. So it's an environment for artists, but likewise it's been an environment of artists. And in that sense, the Impressionists painted these street scenes, which very, very much present the city as this very kind of beautiful, artistic entity. So it's maybe for those reasons that we still think of Paris as being this great exemplar. Although, of course, in terms of urban design modeling or city planning, we have to remember the American influence, the redesign of Washington, D.C., American imperialism in places like the Philippines. It was all based around the Paris urban design model. So for those reasons, I think that's why we still understand Paris to be a beautiful city. But thank you again for those questions. And thank you very, very much for your time and for being here with me today. Take care. Thank you.